When you look at a really old photograph, at first glance, it just looks like a static landscape. A field, some trees, maybe a distant hill.
Yeah, you just kind of assume you are seeing everything there is to see.
Right. But then somebody hands you a magnifying glass and you start looking at the shadows.
And that changes everything.
It really does. You realize those are not just trees, there are actual figures standing there.
Wow, yeah.
Suddenly, this flat, distant landscape turns into a crowded room, and the central figure of the whole scene has just been staring right back at you the entire time. Welcome to Reformed thinking.
That sudden shift in perspective is, well, it is what happens when you read a specific theological treatise by the 18th century thinker Jonathan Edwards.
Yes, the piece is titled, How Were Old Testament Saints Justified?
And he looked at the ancient Hebrew scriptures and asked a question that, frankly, changes the entire landscape.
He asked, how did people who lived centuries before the physical birth of Christ actually secure peace with God?
Edwards is tackling a massive historical puzzle here. Because, we tend to assume those ancient believers were operating a completely different religion.
Right. We picture them following a strict legalistic system. We think they were hoping that if they sacrificed enough animals and kept enough rules, well, maybe God might accept them.
But Edwards proves that assumption is totally false.
He really does. He demonstrates they had a highly developed understanding of a pre-incarnate Christ.
Yes. They were interacting with him directly, and the mechanics of their salvation were identical to the mechanics of salvation for anyone living today.
The mission of our evaluation today is to uncover the precise nature of that interaction.
Okay, so where do we start?
We need to look at how they recognize this pre-incarnate figure. Like, how did they structure their physical worship around him?
Yeah, and how could a system involving the blood of bulls and goats actually provide them with genuine peace of conscience?
If you are listening to this right now, and you have ever read the ancient Hebrew texts and wondered what those early believers actually knew about a Messiah, this deep dive will completely reframe your understanding.
It really will.
Edwards starts his argument by identifying a specific person who shows up repeatedly in the earliest texts.
Right, the text calls him the angel of the Lord, or the messenger of the covenant.
So when you hear the word angel, you usually think of a created being with wings, like Gabriel, for instance.
Sure, that is the common picture. But the Hebrew word, translated as angel, simply means a messenger.
So it just means one who is sent.
Yes. And Edwards' first major assertion is that the person who went before the Israelites in the wilderness, the one who dwelt in the Holy of Holies, was not God the Father.
Wait, really? Not the Father?
Right. It was the pre-incarnate Son of God acting as the Father's messenger.
Okay, that is a huge claim. What is his evidence for that?
He points to Exodus chapter 23 to prove this. God is speaking to Moses.
What does he say?
He says, "Behold, I send an angel before thee to keep thee in the way."
Okay, but that could just be a regular angel, right?
It could, but the critical detail follows immediately after that. God says, "Beware of him and obey his voice and provoke him not, for my name is in him."
My name is in him. That is a very specific phrase.
It is. If the Israelites knew this angel was sent from the Father, this phrase is how they knew this was not just a standard created being.
It sounds to me like an ancient corporate arrangement.
How so?
Well, maybe akin to a royal ambassador who arrives in a foreign province. He carries the king's signet ring.
Yeah, I like that.
He acts distinctly from the king, but he wields the absolute unmitigated authority of the throne.
That ambassador analogy captures the dynamic really well, particularly the aspect of the signet ring.
Because the signet ring represents the king's actual identity.
Yes. When God declares my name is in him, he is making a definitive statement about essence.
Essence as in nature.
Right. In ancient Hebrew theology, the name of Jehovah is inseparable from the nature of Jehovah.
So to possess the name of God within yourself is to possess the divine nature.
Precisely. The Father in heaven sustains the rights of the Godhead. He acts as the chief in the administration of the kingdom.
So this specific angel acts as a messenger sent from the Father.
Yes. But because the divine name is in him, he shares the total, uncreated essence of the Godhead.
And the ancient Israelites actually understood this distinction.
They did. We see this play out mechanically in Joshua chapter 5.
Oh, right. Joshua is camped outside Jericho preparing for a siege.
Yeah. And he encounters a man standing with a drawn sword.
Joshua challenges him, right? He asks if he is for them or for their adversaries.
He does. And the figure identifies himself as the captain of the Lord's host.
And how does Joshua react to that?
When Joshua hears this, he immediately falls on his face to worship.
Which is a big deal because you are not supposed to worship angels.
Spot on. We must pay close attention to the captain's response here.
Does he accept the worship?
He tells Joshua to take off his shoes because the ground he is standing on is holy.
Oh, wow. That is the precise instruction Jehovah gave to Moses at the burning bush.
Yes, a standard created angel always rejects worship in the biblical text.
Right, like in Revelation when John tries to worship the angel.
Yes. And beyond that, a created being cannot make the ground holy simply by standing on it.
So the angel is instructing Joshua to render him full divine respect.
Absolutely. The ancients recognized this messenger as a distinct divine person.
So if they understood this figure was a distinct person carrying the divine essence, they must have possessed a specific vocabulary for him.
They could.
I mean, they could not just call him the messenger in their daily prayers, you know.
Right. They needed proper titles. Edwards highlights the titles they used, and they're fascinating.
Because they sound highly abstract to modern ears, right?
Very abstract. Titles like the word, the name, the glory, the strength, and the honor.
Yeah, modern readers, we view a phrase like the name of the Lord as a figure of speech, like a synonym for God's reputation.
Sure. But Edwards argues that the ancients used it to reference a literal person.
A literal person.
Yes. When the text says God will place his name there in the sanctuary, it means the physical residence of this mediator.
Oh, so God causes his name to inhabit a physical location.
Yes. Edwards pulls a quote from the theologian Van Maastricht. He noted a common doctrinal phrase among the ancient Hebrews.
What was the phrase?
It goes, "He himself is his name, and his name is himself."
Wow. Okay, that completely alters the reading of the Psalms.
It really does.
Yeah.
Think about how David writes.
Yeah, when David writes, "Save me by thy name," or "The name of the Lord comes from afar, burning with his anger."
Right. He is not asking an abstract concept to save him.
No, because an abstract concept does not travel from afar with lips full of indignation.
That is right. He is asking a specific, pre-incarnate divine person to step in and execute justice.
He is actively calling upon the mediator.
Yes, and this interpretation was widespread. Edwards references Philo the Jew.
He was a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, right?
He was, and Philo documented how his contemporaries understood these categories.
What did he say?
Well, Philo referred to this figure as the Word and the name of God.
So he used those specific titles.
He did. He described him as the active instrument through which God created the universe.
That sounds a lot like the Gospel of John.
It is identical theology.
Yeah.
Furthermore, this person is repeatedly called God's strength and God's glory.
And there is a linguistic connection in the Hebrew language regarding this, right?
Yes. The text points out that the root words for bright beams and horns are connected.
Oh, this is fascinating. I have always wondered about this one specific thing in classical art.
What is that?
Like Michelangelo's famous sculpture of Moses. It depicts Moses with literal horns protruding from his head.
Yeah, it looks really bizarre to modern eyes.
It does. Does this linguistic root explain that artistic choice?
It actually does. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai after speaking with this divine person, the text says his face shone.
Like it was radiating light.
Right. But because the Latin Vulgate translation of the Bible interpreted the Hebrew word for radiating beams of light using its alternate meaning of horns.
Artists like Michelangelo literally sculpted horns onto Moses.
Yes. But the theological reality is that horns and bright beams were symbols of this divine person's strength and glory.
So it was a physical manifestation of the mediator's presence.
Precisely. When the Israelites lost the Ark of the Covenant to the Philistines in battle, the text states that God delivered his strength into captivity and his glory into the enemy's hand.
Oh, so they were not speaking poetically about losing a battle.
No, they were speaking of the physical departure of the token of this specific divine person.
The Father dwelt in heaven, but his glory, his name, his strength dwelt on earth among the people.
Yes.
So we have these abstract, majestic titles like name and glory. But if this mediator actually lived among them, did they view him simply as a distant, terrifying force?
Not at all. The ancient texts utilize incredibly intimate relational titles as well.
Like what?
We see the titles Son of God and Israel's Prince.
So the category of a second divine person, specifically recognized as the Son, was well established back then.
It was. Proverbs chapter 30 poses a theological riddle regarding the Creator.
How's it go?
It asks, what is his name and what is his son's name, if thou canst tell?
Wow. That implies a known theological category among the wise of that era.
It does, and we see this manifested physically in the book of Daniel.
Oh, right. King Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes. He throws 3 Israelite men into a blindingly hot furnace.
And when he looks inside, he sees a fourth figure walking in the fire.
Right. And he specifically identifies the form of the fourth as being like the Son of God.
Wait, a Babylonian king recognizes the visual profile of the Son of God?
Yes!
That means the concept had bled into the surrounding cultures.
It had bled into the surrounding cultures because, as Edwards outlines, every surrounding nation adhered to a system of tutelary deities.
Tutelary meaning protective gods, right?
Yes. They believed local or regional protective gods were assigned to them for their salvation.
Okay, so the Persians had a prince.
And the Greeks had a prince. But the Israelites were assigned Michael.
Which the text explicitly calls the Prince of Israel.
Right. And this Michael was the pre-incarnate Son of God.
So the ancients understood that the first person of the deity had committed them to the exclusive care and charge of this specific angel of his presence.
They did.
Let me push back on how the Israelites viewed this arrangement, though.
Okay, go ahead.
If every nation had a local protective deity, the Israelites might have just viewed Michael as their particular regional manager.
Regional manager. That is an interesting way to phrase it.
Yeah, like, did they actually comprehend the magnitude of who was protecting them, or the depth of his affection for them?
The textual evidence shows they comprehended it fully. They routinely mocked the heathen nations for trusting in inferior created deities.
Really? Where do we see that?
Moses states in Deuteronomy, "Their rock is not as our rock, even our enemies themselves being judges."
Ah, so they knew their protector was vastly superior.
Yes, they knew the Son of God was the excellency of Jacob. He was transcendently dear to the Father, the absolute delight of heaven.
And yet, he chose them.
He did. The texts use intense marriage covenant language to describe his disposition toward Israel.
So he willingly chose to become their husband.
Yes. The prophet Malachi calls this messenger of the covenant the one whom ye delight in.
And there is that specific name given to Israel later on, right?
Yes, when Israel is restored, she is given the name Hephzibah.
Which translates to, my delight is in her.
Spot on. They knew the literal heir of the cosmos loved them.
Okay, so if they knew this divine prince loved them that intimately, how did that knowledge shape the physical mechanics of the temple worship?
It shaped everything about it.
Because the sacrificial system seems incredibly bloody and severe. If the mediator was already there and loved them, why construct this massive daily slaughterhouse?
Well, the entire architecture of the temple was built to facilitate their interaction with this mediator.
Okay, so it was all about him.
Yes. He resided over the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies.
And it was through his active mediation that they gained acceptance with the Father.
Precisely. Edwards clarifies the specific function of the mercy seat to explain this.
What does he say about it?
Well, the Greek word used in the Septuagint is halasterion, which translates the Hebrew kaporeth.
And what does that mean literally?
It means the place of propitiation.
That linguistic distinction is critical, I think, because the standard visual for most people is God the Father sitting on the Ark of the Covenant.
Right, like he is using the mercy seat as a throne to hand down judgments.
But Edwards explicitly separates the persons of the Trinity here. The Father is in heaven, and the Son is on the mercy seat.
The separation of stations is his primary point regarding the temple.
Okay, so the halasterion was not a chair for God the Father.
No, it functioned as an altar. It was a movable chariot of the cherubims, specifically for the mediator.
So the Father's fixed throne is the high court of heaven.
And the propitiatory on earth is the local station of the mediator, where atonement is actively presented.
Let's frame it like a legal defense team.
Okay, let's hear it.
The chief judge presides in the high court up in heaven.
Right.
The mediator, acting as the defense attorney, is stationed locally on earth at the mercy seat.
I like this analogy.
So the defense attorney does the groundwork, gathers the appeals, and formally sends them up to the high court so the chief judge can issue an acquittal.
That legal framework mirrors the mechanics of the temple perfectly.
Does Edwards have scriptural proof for this separation?
He proves this by pointing to Solomon's prayer dedicating the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8.
What does Solomon say?
Solomon repeatedly asks God to hear in heaven when the people pray toward the earthly temple.
Why would you pray toward a building in Jerusalem if God is in heaven?
Yes, you pray toward the temple because the mediator is physically stationed there.
The local defense attorney receives the petition and makes it acceptable to the Father in heaven.
Yes, Daniel operates the same way in his famous prayer in chapter 9.
He asks the Father to shine his face on the desolate sanctuary, right?
Yes, and he specifically says, for the Lord's sake.
Oh, so he is asking the Father to act for the sake of the Son who resides there.
That is right.
So if the mediator was doing all the heavy lifting to secure their forgiveness, we really need to reevaluate the physical animal sacrifices?
We definitely do.
Because the common assumption today is that an ancient Israelite sinned, killed a goat, and the goat's blood paid the fine.
Right, like a simple transaction.
Yeah, the transaction was complete, and they went home with a clean slate.
Edwards dismantled that assumption completely.
How so?
Well, the Old Testament saints were not naive. They understood the physical mechanics of a dying animal could not satisfy infinite divine justice.
Because the blood of bulls and goats is fundamentally useless for removing moral guilt.
Yes. The believers were waiting for the mediator to physically incarnate and make a final, complete atonement.
And Edwards cites several psalms to demonstrate this was common knowledge.
He does. In Psalm 50, God says, I will take no bullock out of thine house. If I were hungry, I would not tell thee, for the world is mine.
So God explicitly states he requires no animal sacrifices for their own intrinsic value.
Right. And in Micah chapter 6, the prophet asks if God will be pleased with thousands of rams or 10,000s of rivers of oil.
And the answer is clearly no.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we need to understand how the blood actually interacted with the mercy seat.
Yeah, if the animal's blood was not paying the fine, what was happening on the Day of Atonement when the high priest sprinkled it on the halosterion?
The blood functioned as a physical barrier and a placeholder.
A barrier.
Think about what was inside the Ark of the Covenant. It was the stone tablets of the broken law.
Okay.
And above the Ark, between the cherubim, resided the holy gaze of the mediator.
Right, looking down at the broken law.
So the sprinkled blood covered the lid, creating a barrier between the broken law and divine justice.
But because it was just animal blood, it only suspended the judgment.
Right. The believers understood their guilt was being held in trust by the mediator, awaiting a future permanent resolution.
So if you are a listener right now, think about this. The ancient worshiper bringing a lamb is not purchasing forgiveness.
No, they're bringing a placeholder.
They know the lamb is essentially an IOU.
That is a great way to think of it. Edwards references the prophet Daniel regarding the prophecy of the 70 weeks.
What does that prophecy say?
Daniel predicts a specific future timeline to make an end of sin and to make reconciliation for iniquity.
The necessity of a future timeline proves that an end to sin had not yet been accomplished.
Yes, despite centuries of daily temple sacrifices.
That makes a lot of sense.
Edwards also highlights Zechariah chapter 3, which promises that God will remove the iniquity of that land in one day.
The phrase, in one day, is the linchpin there.
It really is.
They anticipated a singular historical event that would render the entire sacrificial system obsolete. They knew a permanent fix was coming.
They did.
But that raises a significant logical question.
Okay.
If they knew the mediator was going to incarnate to solve the sin issue permanently, did they actually know he was going to suffer and die to achieve it?
Edwards posits that the ancient saints fully expected the Messiah to suffer and die.
Really? Because a divine prince bleeding out seems, well, highly counterintuitive for an ancient warrior culture.
It might seem that way, but the scriptural evidence available to them was massive and undeniable.
Give me some examples.
Daniel chapter 9 states plainly that the Messiah will be cut off, but not for himself.
Okay, so a clear reference to his death.
Yes. Then Zechariah chapter 13 predicts the striking of the shepherd. It talks about the sword awaking against the man that is my fellow.
Meaning God's equal.
Right. And then you have the hyper-specific details of Isaiah chapter 53.
The suffering servant passage.
Yes, it describes a servant who is wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities, and who makes his soul an offering for sin.
So the pious Israelites who meditated on these texts could not miss the reality of a suffering mediator.
They really could not. It was right there in plain text.
I have to raise a historical counter-argument here.
Go for it.
If the text was so glaringly obvious about a dying Messiah, why were the religious leaders in the first century so appalled by the concept?
That is a fair question.
I mean, when Jesus began predicting his own death, even his closest disciples rebuked him. Why did the religious establishment reject a suffering savior if it had been established theology for centuries?
Edwards addresses that historical shift directly. He argues that by the first century, the religious establishment had become intensely carnal and politically motivated.
Because they were suffering under Roman occupation?
Yes, their theology morphed to fit their political desires. They wanted a military conqueror to break the yoke of Rome, not a suffering servant to atone for sin.
So their interpretation of Scripture conformed to their own pride.
It did. And Edwards notes a fascinating development among later Jewish scholars.
What did they do?
Realizing the undeniable clarity of texts like Isaiah 53, they actually invented the concept of two messiahs.
Wait, really? They invented a second Messiah just to avoid the suffering aspect.
Yes, they theorized one suffering Messiah, which they called Messiah ben Joseph,
And the other one?
a second, separate conquering Messiah
Mm-hmm.
called Messiah ben David.
That is incredible. They did this because the texts detailing a suffering servant were too blatant to ignore or explain away.
Right. But the ancient pre-corruption saints understood it was one mediator who would accomplish both salvation and conquest through his own suffering.
Okay, that explains the blindness of the first century establishment, but Edwards goes even further than that, does he not?
He does. He claims that this early patriarchal theology of a suffering divine son was so widespread that it corrupted into the mythologies of surrounding nations.
This part is wild. How does Edwards trace the corruption of these ancient prophecies into Egyptian or Greek myths,
He looks back to the original prophecy in Genesis chapter 3.
where God promises that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent,
Yes, but in the process, the serpent will bruise his heel.
which is the primal promise of a divine son coming down to suffer, fight a monster, and secure salvation?
Spot on. Over centuries, as human populations dispersed, that core prophecy degraded.
Like a massive game of theological broken telephone.
Yes, we see this degraded echo in the Persian traditions of the combats of Mithras.
And we see it in the Egyptian myth of the murder and resurrection of Osiris.
I do.
But I think we see the exact mechanics of it most clearly in the Greek tales of Hercules.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the parallels.
You have the son of the high god who comes down to earth, suffers intensely, and fights monsters.
He literally fights the Hydra.
A multi-headed
Yeah.
serpent. And then he dies due to poisoned blood and eventually ascends to Olympus.
It is a corrupted, distorted vision of the suffering servant crushing the serpent's head.
The parallels are just undeniable when you lay them out like that.
Edwards argues these myths are not random fiction. They are the degraded memory of a real prophecy passed down from antiquity.
So the heathen nations retained the fractured shell of the story.
Yes, but the ancient Israelites maintained the pure, written revelation of the Mediator.
So having established that the ancient saints possessed a clear understanding of a suffering mediator, we have to evaluate the final piece of the puzzle.
The actual mechanics of salvation.
Yes. How did this knowledge apply to their personal standing before God? What was the exact mechanism of an individual acquiring justification back then?
Edwards establishes that the saints were justified purely by faith in the Mediator.
And their sacrifices?
They were symbolic representations of their faith, not the meritorious cause of their justification. Edwards relies heavily on the concept of forensic justification to explain this.
When Edwards talks about forensic justification, he is pushing back against rival theological views of his own era, is he not?
He is. He is insisting that justification is a legal declaration of righteousness, not a gradual process of moral improvement.
Right. Justification means receiving an acquittal from a judge. It is an immediate legal status.
Yes. And Edwards specifically notes that this declaration is entirely disconnected from human performance or works of the law.
And he clarifies that the term works refers to all works, both good and evil.
He cites Romans chapter 9, verse 11 regarding Jacob and Esau to prove this.
The text points out that God's electing purpose stood before the twins were born, right?
Yes, before they had done any good or evil. Therefore, justification cannot be based on the ceremonial Jewish laws or personal moral achievements.
We need to define the exact mechanics of faith in this context, because faith can often be treated as a vague mystical feeling.
But Edwards is describing a highly active legal mechanism.
Let's look at the worshiper in the temple again. When the ancient worshiper walked up to the altar and laid his hands heavily on the head of the goat, what was actually happening?
Well, he was not hoping the goat's inherent goodness would save him.
No, he was acting out a legal proxy form.
The laying on of hands was the physical manifestation of imputation,
The worshiper was transferring his guilt to the animal.
which served as the stand-in for the mediator, but it was a double transfer.
How so?
By faith, the worshiper was actively choosing and appointing the mediator's future perfect sacrifice as his own.
Edwards describes faith as having a natural suitableness, right?
He does. It is the active movement of the soul coming to the sacrifice, resting in it, and legally committing one's cause to the advocate.
They were legally binding themselves to what the Messiah would accomplish in the future.
Yes. And Edwards points to Abraham as the ultimate example of an Old Testament believer possessing precise, saving faith in the future work of the mediator.
He highlights the account where Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac.
He does.
But how does that specific, terrifying test demonstrate Abraham's faith in a future mediator?
Well, the New Testament explicitly states that Abraham received Isaac back in a figure, or as a parable.
Meaning Abraham received the antitype of Christ slain and risen in the type of his son Isaac.
Yes. When Abraham saw the ram caught in the thicket, provided by God as a substitute for his son, he was looking directly at the mechanism of the atonement.
That was the moment Abraham saw Christ's day and was glad.
He possessed saving faith in the future work of the mediator, understanding substitutionary death and resurrection through the physical symbol provided on that mountain.
When you synthesize the massive scope of Edwards' arguments, the conclusion rewrites our basic assumptions.
It really does. The ancient believers were not practicing a primitive, works-based religion centered on animal blood.
No, they were saved precisely the same way later believers were, by trusting in the divine Son of God.
He was the mediator, whose physical presence they oriented their worship around.
And whose future suffering they anticipated through symbolic sacrifices.
It is a totally unified system of salvation from start to finish. The object of faith was always the same mediator, only the vantage point in history changed.
The ancient saints looked forward to the cross through shadows and types, while modern believers look backward to it through historical record.
But the legal mechanism of imputation remains identical.
Listeners, think about the sheer volume of clues the ancient believers possessed.
It is staggering.
If they were able to look at a cloud settling in a tabernacle or a wooden box covered in gold and clearly perceive the pre-incarnate Son of God stepping in to advocate for them, what are you missing when you casually read those ancient texts today?
That is a great question.
We started this evaluation talking about a blurry historical photograph. We assume it is just a flat landscape of ancient laws and strange, bloody rituals.
But if you look closer, through the lens of what these ancient saints actually believed, the picture comes alive.
Is it possible that the central character of the entire story is hiding in plain sight on every single page, waiting for you to finally notice him?